The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle as Sergeant Michael Thompson adjusted his red tunic for the third time. 27 years of service to the Queen's Guard had taught him that precision was everything. Every button perfectly aligned, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, every movement calculated and deliberate. The tourists would begin arriving soon, cameras ready to capture the stoic faces of Britain's most disciplined soldiers. Michael had seen it all during his years of duty. Visitors from every corner of the world would gather behind the rope barriers, snapping photos and whispering among themselves about the guards who stood motionless for hours. Some tourists tried to make them laugh, others attempted elaborate dances, and a few even threw objects hoping for a reaction. Through it all, Michael and his fellow guards remained statue still, their eyes fixed straight ahead, their expressions unchanged. This particular Tuesday started like any other. The changing of the guard ceremony had concluded without incident, and Michael had taken his position at the main entrance. The familiar weight of his bearskin hat settled on his head as he gripped his rifle and assumed the traditional stance. His polished boots reflected the morning light, and his white gloves were spotless against the dark metal of his weapon. The crowd began to gather as it always did. Families with excited children pressed against the barriers. Tour guides explained the history and traditions to wide-eyed visitors, and the constant clicking of camera shutters created a rhythmic soundtrack to the scene. Michael had learned to tune out the noise, to exist in a bubble of absolute concentration where nothing could break his focus. But today would be different. Today, something would happen that would challenge everything Michael believed about duty, protocol, and the invisible walls that separated the guards from the outside world. It would start with a simple question from a small voice in the crowd, a voice that would somehow penetrate the armor of tradition that surrounded him like a fortress. As the morning progressed, the usual parade of tourists cycled through the viewing area. School groups arrived with their teachers pointing and explaining the significance of the ceremony. Business travelers on lunch breaks stopped to take quick selfies before hurrying back to their meetings. Elderly couples shared stories of previous visits, their voices filled with nostalgia and wonder. Michael maintained his position through it all, his training allowing him to remain perfectly still, despite the growing heat of the day. His peripheral vision caught glimpses of the crowd, but his eyes remained fixed on the distant point he had chosen as his focus. This was the discipline that made the Queen's Guard legendary, the unwavering commitment to duty that had been passed down through generations of soldiers. The sounds of the city hummed beyond the castle walls. Traffic, construction, the general buzz of London life continuing its relentless pace. But within the courtyard, time seemed suspended. The guards existed in their own realm, bound by centuries of tradition and an unspoken code of conduct that demanded absolute perfection. As noon approached, Michael noticed a subtle shift in the crowd's energy. Conversations became more animated, and he could sense people pointing in his direction more frequently than usual. Something was building, though he couldn't identify what it was. His years of experience had taught him to trust these instincts, to remain alert even while appearing completely detached from his surroundings. The cobblestones beneath his feet had been worn smooth by countless generations of guards who had stood in this same spot, maintaining this same vigil. Each stone held stories of duty and dedication, of men who had served their country with honor and pride. Michael felt the weight of that history pressing down on him, reminding him of the responsibility he carried not just to the crown, but to every guard who had come before him. But tradition, he was about to learn, sometimes had to bend to accommodate the most unexpected moments of human connection. The rigid protocols that governed his every movement were about to be tested by something no manual had ever prepared him for. The innocent curiosity of a child whose simple presence would transform an ordinary Tuesday into a day that would be remembered by everyone who witnessed what was about to unfold. The wheelchair appeared at the edge of Michael's peripheral vision just after noon. Its occupant was a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, his small frame dwarfed by the adult-sized chair that his parents were carefully maneuvering through the crowd. The child's face was turned upward, his eyes wide with wonder as he took in the grandeur of the castle walls and the imposing figure of the guard standing before him. Thomas Mitchell had been looking forward to this day for months. His parents, Sarah and David, had promised him a trip to see the Queen's Guard after he had spent weeks in the hospital following his latest surgery. The doctors had explained that his condition meant he would likely never walk, but Thomas had accepted this news with the remarkable resilience that children often possess. Instead of dwelling on what he couldn't do, he focused on all the amazing things he still wanted to see and experience. "Mum, why doesn't he move?" Thomas whispered, his voice carrying just far enough for Michael to hear, despite his training to block out external sounds. "Is he a real person or a statue?" Sarah knelt beside her son's wheelchair, her voice gentle but firm as she explained the traditions of the Queen's Guard. "He's very real, sweetheart. These brave men stand perfectly, still to protect the Queen and show respect for our country. They've been doing this for hundreds of years." Thomas studied Michael with the intense curiosity that only children possess. He noticed how the guard's chest rose and fell with each breath, how his eyes occasionally blinked, and how tiny beads of sweat had begun to form on his forehead despite the cool October air. The boy was fascinated by this living statue, this person who could remain so perfectly motionless while the world bustled around him. "But doesn't he get tired?" Thomas asked, his voice growing slightly louder. "My arms get tired when I have to stay in one position too long during my treatments." Other tourists began to notice the interaction, or rather the lack thereof. They watched as the small boy in the wheelchair continued to ask questions, while the guard maintained his stoic silence. Some smiled at Thomas's innocent curiosity, while others seemed impatient with what they perceived as a disruption to the traditional viewing experience. Michael was fighting an internal battle, unlike any he had experienced in his years of service. The boy's questions weren't the usual attempts to make him laugh or break character. There was something genuine and pure about the child's curiosity, something that bypassed all of Michael's professional defenses and spoke directly to his heart. The guard had answered similar questions hundreds of times in his mind, but always silently, always maintaining the facade of indifference that his role demanded. "Dad, do you think he can hear me?" Thomas asked his father, who was standing behind, the wheelchair with his hands resting protectively on the handles. David Mitchell cleared his throat softly. "I'm sure he can hear you, Thomas, but the guards aren't allowed to talk while they're on duty. It's part of their job to stay very still and quiet." Thomas considered this explanation with the seriousness that children bring to important matters. He wheeled himself slightly closer to the rope barrier, as close as the crowd would allow, and studied Michael's face with renewed interest. The guard's features were sharp and focused, his jaw set in a line of determination, but Thomas thought he detected something else there. A softness around the eyes that suggested the man behind the uniform was listening to every word. Crowd around them began to grow. Word was spreading that something unusual was happening, though no one could quite put their finger on what it was. The normal ebb and flow of tourists had slowed to a crawl as people lingered to watch the interaction between the boy and the guard. Camera phones appeared, though most remained lowered out of respect for what seemed to be developing into a moment too precious to interrupt with the harsh click of a shutter. Michael could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, but his attention remained focused on the small voice that continued to drift up from below. The boy's questions were becoming more specific, more personal, and each one struck deeper into the guard's carefully constructed armor of professional detachment. "My name is Thomas," the boy said, his voice clear and strong despite his small size. "I've been sick for a really long time, but I'm getting better now. The doctors say I'm very brave, just like you. Do you think we could be friends?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Michael had been taught about duty and protocol. Friendship was not something that existed in the world of the Queen's Guard during ceremonial duties. There were only soldiers and civilians, duty and distraction, right and wrong. But as Thomas waited hopefully for some sign of acknowledgement, Michael began to understand that some rules were written by bureaucrats, while others were written by the heart. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting new shadows across the courtyard, and highlighting the contrast between the rigid formality of the guard's uniform and the casual innocence of the boy in the wheelchair. Two worlds were about to collide in a way that would challenge everyone present, to reconsider what they thought. They knew about duty, compassion, and the courage required to make the right choice when no one was watching except everyone. The moment arrived without fanfare or dramatic music, just a slight shift in the afternoon breeze and the sound of Thomas adjusting his position in his wheelchair. Michael had been listening to the boys' gentle chatter for nearly an hour, each question and observation chipping away at his resolve to maintain perfect protocol. The child had talked about his favorite books, his pet hamster named Winston, and his dreams of becoming a soldier when he grew up. "I know you're not supposed to talk," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying a wisdom that seemed far beyond his 8 years. "But I just wanted you to know that you're my hero, even if you never say anything back." Something inside Michael's chest tightened. He had been called many things during his career: disciplined, dedicated, professional, but never someone's hero. The word coming from this brave little boy who had clearly faced his own battles carried more weight than any medal or commendation he had ever received. The crowd had grown silent, as if sensing that something significant was about to happen. Even the usual clicking of cameras had stopped. Parents held their children closer and elderly visitors leaned forward in anticipation. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Michael's training screamed at him to remain motionless. 27. Years of discipline demanded that he ignore the child and continue his duty exactly as prescribed. But something else, something deeper and more fundamental, was telling him that sometimes the most important duty was to recognize the humanity in another person. The guard's eyes flickered downward for just a fraction of a second, meeting Thomas's expectant gaze. In that brief moment of connection, Michael saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hope. Pure, innocent hope, radiating from a child who had every reason to be bitter about his circumstances, but instead chose to see wonder and heroism in the world around him. Thomas's face lit up as he caught that momentary glance. "You did hear me," he whispered excitedly, his small hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. "I knew you were listening." The boy's joy was infectious, spreading through the crowd like ripples on a pond. Smiles appeared on previously neutral faces, and several people wiped away tears they hadn't realized were forming. This wasn't just about a guard and a child anymore. It was about the recognition of shared humanity in a world that often seemed increasingly divided and cold. Michael felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. Every instinct told him to look away, to restore the professional distance that his position demanded. But Thomas's happiness was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, impossible to ignore, and too precious to dismiss. "Sergeant Thompson." The voice came from behind him, crisp and authoritative. It was Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, making his routine inspection rounds. Michael's blood turned to ice as he realized he had been caught in his moment of wavering attention. The crowd tensed, sensing trouble approaching. Thomas's parents moved closer to their son's wheelchair, suddenly aware that their presence might have created a problem for the kind guard who had shown their boy such gentle attention. "Is there a problem here?" the lieutenant colonel asked, his voice carrying the weight of decades of military command. His eyes swept over the assembled crowd before settling on Thomas, who had shrunk back in his wheelchair at the stern tone. Michael's mind raced through possible responses, none of which seemed adequate to explain what had been happening. How could he articulate the way this child's courage had affected him? How could he describe the moment when duty and compassion had collided, leaving him standing at a crossroads between protocol and humanity? "No, sir," Michael replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest, "just maintaining position as ordered." But Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was no fool. He had been watching from a distance, had seen the subtle changes in Michael's posture, the brief moment of eye contact, the way the crowd had gathered with unusual intensity. More importantly, he had seen the small boy in the wheelchair and the hope written across his young face. Thomas looked up at the imposing officer with the same fearless curiosity he had shown toward Michael. "Sir, is the soldier in trouble because of me? I was just trying to be his friend." The lieutenant colonel studied the boy for a long moment, taking in the wheelchair, the medical alert bracelet on his thin wrist, and the unmistakable courage in his voice. Here was a child who had clearly faced his own battles with the kind of bravery that military men spent their entire careers trying to cultivate. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see whether this moment would end in disappointment and harsh enforcement of rules, or if something else entirely was about to unfold. The afternoon sun continued its slow journey across the sky, casting longer shadows and highlighting the tension that had settled over the courtyard like a heavy blanket. What happened next would depend on whether the lieutenant colonel chose to see this situation through the lens of rigid military protocol, or through the eyes of a man who understood that sometimes the greatest acts of service happen when we choose courage over comfort, compassion over convention. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison knelt down to Thomas's eye level, his stern military bearing softening as he took in the boy's worried expression. The crowd watched in amazement as this imposing officer, whose uniform commanded respect and whose presence demanded attention, transformed himself into someone approachable enough for a frightened child. "What's your name, young man?" the lieutenant colonel asked, his voice gentle but still carrying the authority of his rank. "Thomas Mitchell, sir," the boy replied, his small voice steadier than anyone expected. "I'm sorry if I got the soldier in trouble. He was just being kind to me." Harrison glanced up at Michael, who stood frozen between competing duties. The sergeant's face remained impassive, but the lieutenant colonel had spent enough years reading men under pressure to recognize the internal struggle taking place behind those disciplined features. "Tell me, Thomas," Harrison continued, "what do you know about the Queen's Guard?" The boy's face brightened despite his concern about causing problems. "They're the bravest soldiers in the world. They protect the Queen and never move from their posts no matter what happens. My dad says they're like superheroes, but real ones." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd at the child's earnest explanation. Parents squeezed their own children's hands a little tighter, and several elderly visitors nodded in approval at the boy's understanding of duty and service. Harrison studied Thomas for another moment, noting the medical equipment attached to his wheelchair, the pallor of his skin that spoke of long hours in hospital rooms, and the determined set of his jaw that suggested this child had learned about courage through his own difficult journey. "You're absolutely right about that," the lieutenant colonel said. "But do you know what makes them even more special than superheroes?" Thomas shook his head, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Superheroes are just stories," Harrison explained, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent courtyard. "But these men are real. They choose to serve others, to stand in uncomfortable positions for hours at a time, to put duty before their own comfort. They do it not because they have magical powers, but because they have something even more powerful, the choice to do what's right." Michael felt his throat tighten at his commanding officer's words. This wasn't the dressing down he had expected. Instead, it seemed to be building toward something else entirely. "Now," Harrison continued, rising to his full height while keeping his attention focused on Thomas, "I've been watching you for the past hour, and I've seen something remarkable. You've been sitting here in your wheelchair, asking questions and sharing stories, showing the same kind of patience and dedication that we require from our guards. That tells me you understand what real strength looks like." Thomas's parents exchanged glances behind their son's chair, unsure where this conversation was heading, but sensing that something significant was unfolding. "I've also been watching Sergeant Thompson," Harrison said, his gaze shifting to Michael. "And I've seen a soldier who understands that sometimes the most important duty we can perform is to recognize the courage in others, especially when that courage comes from someone who faces challenges most of us can't imagine." The lieutenant colonel paused, letting his words settle over the crowd like a blessing. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. "Sergeant Thompson," Harrison said formally, "you are hereby granted a brief break from standard ceremonial protocol. I believe our young friend here deserves to meet one of his heroes properly." The crowd collectively held its breath. Michael's eyes widened in surprise, and Thomas's face broke into a smile that could have powered the entire city of London. "Really?" Thomas whispered, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might break the spell. "Really?" Harrison confirmed. "But this is a special exception, made for a special young man who has shown us all what real bravery looks like. Michael felt tears threatening to blur his vision as he processed what was happening. After 27 years of rigid adherence to protocol, he was being given permission to step outside the boundaries of tradition for perhaps the most important reason he could imagine: to honor the courage of a child who had taught him something profound about the true meaning of service. The afternoon sun seemed to shine brighter as Michael prepared to take the most significant steps of his military career, not in parade formation or in response to commands, but toward a small boy in a wheelchair who had somehow managed to see past the uniform to find the human heart beating underneath. What followed would create a memory that would be passed down through generations, a story that would remind people that sometimes the most powerful acts of service happen when we choose to break the rules for all the right reasons. Michael took his first step away from his post in over 2 hours, and the sound of his polished boot against the cobblestone seemed to echo through the hushed courtyard like a bell tolling the start of something extraordinary. The crowd parted, instinctively, creating a clear path between the guard and the boy who had been waiting so patiently for this moment. "Hello, Thomas," Michael said, his voice warm and genuine as he approached the wheelchair. "I heard you wanted to be friends." The smile that spread across Thomas's face was radiant enough to melt the coldest heart. "You know my name," he exclaimed, his small hands clapping together in delight. "I can't believe you're really talking to me." Michael knelt down beside the wheelchair, bringing himself to Thomas's eye level just as the lieutenant colonel had done moments before. Up close, the guard could see the full extent of the boy's condition, the way his legs lay still beneath the blanket covering them, the medical alert bracelet that spoke of ongoing health challenges, and the slight tremor in his hands that suggested treatment-related side effects. But what struck Michael most powerfully was the light in Thomas's eyes. Despite everything this child had endured, there was no bitterness, no self-pity, no anger at the unfairness of his situation. Instead, there was pure joy at meeting his hero, curiosity about the world around him, and a resilience that put most adults to shame. "I've been listening to everything you've said," Michael admitted, his voice soft enough that only Thomas and his parents could hear clearly. "You told me about your hamster Winston, about your favorite books, and about wanting to be a soldier someday. You really were listening." Thomas practically bounced in his wheelchair with excitement. "Mom and Dad said you couldn't talk, but I knew you could hear me. I could see it in your eyes." The crowd had grown considerably, with people abandoning their tour groups and lunch plans to witness this unprecedented interaction. Cameras appeared, but they were held respectfully, capturing the moment without intruding upon its sanctity. Even the most hardened tourists seemed to understand that they were witnessing something rare and precious. "Can I ask you something, Thomas?" Michael said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "You've been very sick, haven't you? And you must have spent a lot of time in hospitals." Thomas nodded solemnly. "The doctors say I'm getting better, though, and they say I'm very brave, but I don't always feel brave. Sometimes I get scared, especially at night when I'm alone in the hospital room." Michael felt his heart clench at the honesty in the child's voice. Here was a boy who had faced fears that most adults never had to confront, yet he was worried about not being brave enough. "Can I tell you a secret?" Michael asked, leaning closer. "Sometimes I get scared too, standing here for hours at a time, knowing that everyone is watching, trying to do everything perfectly. It can be frightening. But I've learned that being brave doesn't mean you're never scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared." Thomas considered this revelation with the seriousness it deserved. "So when I go back to the hospital next week for my treatment, and I'm scared but I do it anyway, that makes me brave?" "That makes you one of the bravest people I've ever met," Michael confirmed, and the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. "In fact, I think you're braver than any of us guards. We only have to stand still and look serious. You have to fight battles that we can't even imagine." The boy's parents, Sarah and David, were fighting back tears as they watched this gentle giant of a man validate their son's struggles in a way that no doctor or counselor had ever managed. Their child, who had endured so much with such grace, was finally being recognized for the warrior he truly was. "Would you like to know something about being a guard?" Michael asked, reaching into his jacket pocket. Thomas nodded eagerly, his eyes wide with anticipation. Michael pulled out a small pin, his personal regimental badge, polished to a brilliant shine. It wasn't something he was supposed to give away, but some rules he was learning were meant to be broken for the right reasons. "This belonged to my grandfather," Michael explained, holding the badge where Thomas could see it clearly. "He was a guard here 50 years ago, and he gave it to me when I joined the regiment. It's supposed to bring courage to whoever carries it." He placed the badge gently in Thomas's small palm, closing the boy's fingers around it. "I think you need this more than I do, and I think my grandfather would be honored to have such a brave young man carry it." Thomas stared down at the badge in his hand, as if it were made of the most precious metal in the world. When he looked up, tears of joy were streaming down his cheeks. "Are you sure this must be very special to you?" "It is," Michael agreed. "That's why I want you to have it, because you're very special too." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, the sound rolling across the courtyard like thunder. Even Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was wiping away tears, his usual stern demeanor completely abandoned in the face of such genuine emotion. But the most powerful moment was still to come. Thomas clutched the regimental badge to his chest and looked up at Michael with eyes shining with gratitude and something else: determination. The boy straightened his shoulders as much as his condition would allow and said words that would echo through the courtyard and into the hearts of everyone present. "Mr. Michael," Thomas said, his young voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent crowd, "when I grow up and get better, I want to be just like you. I want to protect people and make them feel safe. Will you teach me how to be brave like a real guard?" Michael felt his composure finally crack. A tear rolled down his cheek as he looked at this incredible child who had somehow maintained such hope and ambition, despite everything life had thrown at him. The guard reached out and gently placed his white-gloved hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Thomas," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion, "you don't need me to teach you how to be brave. You already are the bravest person I know. But I promise you this: whenever you're scared, whenever you're facing something difficult, you hold on to that badge and remember that you have an entire regiment of guards who believe in you." The boy nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of the promise he was receiving. Then, with the kind of pure impulse that only children possess, Thomas wheeled his chair forward slightly and wrapped his thin arms around Michael's neck in a fierce hug. The embrace lasted only a few seconds, but it seemed to contain years' worth of gratitude, hope, and mutual respect. When Thomas finally pulled back, his face was glowing with happiness. "Thank you for being my friend," he whispered. Michael wiped away his tears and stood up slowly, his knees somewhat unsteady after the emotional exchange. As he looked around the courtyard, he saw that not a single person in the crowd had dry eyes. Hardened business executives were sobbing openly, tough-looking tourists were hugging their children tighter, and even the other guards who had gathered to witness the scene were struggling to maintain their composure. "Lieutenant Colonel." Harrison stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of his rank but softened by obvious emotion. "You have just witnessed something extraordinary. You've seen what happens when duty meets compassion, when protocol gives way to humanity, and when two brave souls recognize the courage in each other." The crowd erupted in applause once again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just appreciation for a touching moment. It was recognition that they had all been changed by what they had witnessed. Parents looked at their children differently, seeing potential heroes in their young faces. Couples held hands tighter, reminded of what really mattered in life. Strangers smiled at each other, connected by their shared experience of witnessing pure goodness in action. Thomas's parents, Sarah and David, approached Michael as the crowd began to slowly disperse. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke. "Thank you," she said simply. "You have no idea what this means to him, to us. He's going to treasure this moment for the rest of his life." "No," Michael replied, shaking both their hands warmly. "Thank you. Your son reminded me why I became a soldier in the first place. It wasn't just to follow orders or maintain traditions. It was to serve others, to protect what's good in this world. Thomas is everything that's good in this world. David Mitchell, a man who had spent months watching his son endure treatments and setbacks with remarkable grace, finally allowed himself to break down. He talks about you guards all the time, he managed between tears. He says you're proof that there are still heroes in the world. After today, I think he's right. As the family prepared to leave, Thomas called out one more time. Mr. Michael, I'm going to get better, and then I'm going to come back and visit you. Will you still be here? Michael knelt down one final time. Thomas, even if I'm not standing right here, I'll be somewhere nearby, and I'll be thinking about my brave friend who taught me what real courage looks like. And remember, you carry a piece of the guard with you now. That makes you part of our family forever. The boy smiled and carefully tucked the badge into his jacket pocket, right over his heart. As his parents wheeled him away, Thomas waved until Michael was completely out of sight, his face radiant with joy and purpose. Word of what had happened spread quickly through social media and news outlets. The story of the palace guard who broke protocol for a boy in a wheelchair became an international sensation, viewed millions of times and shared by people around the world who needed to be reminded that kindness and courage still existed. But for Michael Thompson, the real impact wasn't measured in viral videos or news coverage. It was measured in the way he approached each day of his remaining service, remembering that behind every uniform was a human heart, and that sometimes the most important duty a soldier could perform was to recognize the heroism in others. 6 months later, Michael received a letter. It was from Thomas, written in careful handwriting and accompanied by a photo of the boy standing with the aid of leg braces, his face beaming with pride. The letter simply read, "Dear Mr. Michael, I'm getting stronger every day. The doctors say I might walk again soon. I still have your badge and it still makes me brave. Thank you for believing in me. Your friend forever, Thomas." Michael kept that letter in his jacket pocket for the rest of his career, right next to his heart, where all the most important things belong.